most wonderful, open-minded community, international-minded, and our purpose to bring you more education, more knowledge, and more scholars to share with you their knowledge, their background, and tonight is one. Before introducing our speaker, let me let you know that our next gathering is on February 21st, and we will have a presentation by Ambassador Adrian Pastoro and Dr. Andrew King. They will be discussing another interesting topic. Can democracy be safe? And why bother? So they will be here breaking each other's bones, discussing it, and they will be attending, they will be giving their lecture in 118 Eliot, and will be sharing with you their views, and hopefully they will not break each other's views. Now, on to tonight's program. Tonight, we are proud to introduce Dr. Julie Snorek, the newest member of our Windham Water Council Board. She will present a talk entitled Degrowth, How Our Blessings Have Become a curse. Dr. Snorek at her first Windham Water Council event last June with the exciting program, Youth Demand Action on Climate Change. She facilitated a panel of youth who talked about their activities and ideas. Then members of the community worked together with them in small groups on recommendations and plans to support them in their actions. Her talk tonight is also a call for action in this area of climate change. She will talk about new patterns of development, a future of regeneration, sustainability, justice, and degrowth. Dr. Julie Snorek is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Environmental Studies Department in Dartmouth College. She has spent over 15 years studying climate change, environmentally induced migration, and pattern of development, working mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa. As a social ecologist, she has been developing an intricate understanding of social, ecological, and political transition in the States, and shares in Sahara and in Sahel, where she has lived and worked with rural, nomadic, and semi-nomadic societies. Dr. Snorek received a PhD from Autonomous University of Barcelona in 2016 and MS from SIT. With this humble introduction, let us welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Snorek.
Good evening, everyone. And I'll also say Matchaleka, which is from Tamashek, which is a language I learned living in West Africa and Niger and in Mali. And it's spoken by the Tuareg people who are pastoralists. And Matchaleka, in essence, it means, how are things coming out? And this idea of coming out as a pastoralist is related to a lot of things around the environment. And so it's, how is the grass coming out of the soil? And how is the milk coming out of the cow or the camel? And also, how is the rain coming out of the sky? And all of these things that are so important in that worldview of the people that I lived with for about 12 years on and off, I really want to bring them up because I think this is quite relevant to what we're talking about today. And the way that they see the world is something that's quite relevant to us. There's another phrase in that culture, and it's also the name of an album by a favorite band that's called Tenariwen, who's also a Tuareg band. And it's Aman Iman Ach is Suder, which means water is life and milk is hope. So what have I done in sharing with you all these different greetings? Well, I'm trying to point out to you some of the things that are quite essential to staying alive, to living well, to our livelihoods, etc. And what are those things? Was anybody listening? What are some of the things that are important to pastoralists in staying alive? Water, milk, soil, grass, and hope, right? And hope. So you are paying attention. That's good. That was the first test. So tonight we're going to be talking about degrowth. It's a concept that has been based in this idea of a need for so-called Western economies to take up a little bit less of the global resources, leaving more for others, right? Well, there's also more to it than just that. It's also a radical shift in the way that we think about the economy and the way that we think about our lives and our livelihoods. And part of this is changing the source of our thinking from our heads that we spend so much time in and moving into the heart. And this walk is also a walk from moving from the individual, separated person into collaboration, into another idea that I've been learning very briefly about in my work in South Africa, which is called Ubuntu, which essentially in English it means a person is another person, is a person because of other people. So we can't make ourselves, we have no self-made men, we can't stay on an island and be someone in that concept, in that conceptualization of the world, Ubuntu. And this, in fact, is also part of the pathways that we'll talk about for degrowth. So I'm giving you all this introduction so that this word degrowth doesn't scare you, because I imagine it's a bit scary to think about degrowth. It's contrary to all of the ideologies that we've had about our economy for so long. But I would argue also that here in Brattleboro, there are many degrowthers. There are many people who are practicing the things that are espoused to be a part of degrowth. And I'm very grateful to be living here and to have this be my home, even though I've done a lot of traveling, in fact, which I'm very grateful for as well. I confess I'm not an economist. I'm not coming to this from that perspective. As was presented in the introduction, I'm a social ecologist, which essentially means that I like to think of ways to reconstruct and transform the ways that we look at society and the environment. And tonight is one of those actions. So I'm inviting you all not just to sit and listen to what I'm saying, but to be a part of the thinking about this idea as we inform ourselves. I am not a degrowther yet. I can't really say that I'm a master of these concepts, but I'm really welcoming you all to think through them with me. So I went to Niger for the first time in 2005. I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and at that time, climate change really wasn't a big concern in my mind. It wasn't what I considered the most dire environmental problem. I was 25, and climate change was being discussed in rather a lot of arenas at the time, but it wasn't on my radar. I spent 2 years living with Tuareg people in a semi-nomadic village. Most of the people were sedentary, learned some local languages and did a few things with people, and mostly they taught me a lot. It was a place where I would say, despite having a doctorate, I probably received my best education from people there. My perspective on climate change changed when I came back to Brattleboro, in fact. And Tim Stevenson, I don't know if he's here, but he was holding an event talking about this idea that we're moving towards peak oil. And it really touched me in the way that I thought, this is something I want to devote my life to and work on. And I returned to Niger in 2009 with this very small scholarship to study environmentally induced migration and learn about what are the causes that's making people leave their livelihoods and leave behind their rural areas and move to cities. And is it a choice? Or is it something that's induced by something else? And I put this picture up here to kind of represent some of the stresses that people are experiencing in that region. So what's happening here is that people are gathering water. It's probably early in the morning because these wells, especially during the driest part of the year, will run out of water because of using that water. They're fed by the rain, and so the water is infiltrating into the aquifer and filling up this well. Typically, these are about 200 meters deep, so that's about a football field and a half that 3 donkeys have to walk in order to pull out some water at the bottom of these wells. There's a challenge that's going on for people who are getting water this way to feed their livestock, to bring water to their family. It's not about contamination of water, even though that's a big deal there. The challenge that they're facing is that climate change is inducing more rainfall variability for people. And what that means is that it might rain over there, but it won't rain over there. And so it's not creating something that will allow the water to fill up that aquifer in the way that it used to. So more drought, more variability, meaning less grass in certain areas, and more variability to where the grass is and where the water is. The other problem that they're facing is political. And that's related to the fact that the government has set up policies based on a certain model of development that requires sedentarization or opens up spaces to be exploited by many different people. And it's the latter that these people are facing. And so up here, you have a lot more pastoralists bringing in their herds from other parts and other countries and exploiting this water and this land. And it's just completely usurped the local commons-based institutions that manage that land. And so you have, at water points, at times, you have sometimes bloody conflicts that take place. There's no institutions, there's no police to really come out and help people deal with the problems they're facing, to manage who gets access first and how much, because they're waiting until that water runs out and then it's noon and you have the sun shining down and it's about 40 degrees Celsius, which is about 110. And so really it's a very stressful livelihood to manage. So people are moving to the cities. And they're not able to do a whole lot. But they're also losing access to this area. So this is all to explain a little bit about the context of a place that I spent a long time in, the context for my pastoral education, but also to talk about the objectives of state making. State making is based on an idea of growth and making the land valid. And so even though people here understand and have this cosmology that's attached to understanding their land, it wasn't a valid land use to be nomadic in this area. And so that's essentially why the policies weren't supportive of people, even though they're experiencing manageable difficulties as far as water, as far as access to pasture, as far as managing a space that's pasture. These aren't things that are impossible to solve. So essentially, pastoralism in Niger, according to most of the experts there that don't see changes happening for the political system and see climate change scenarios that are greater variability, is that pastoralism will end in Niger. Another person that I've met along my journeys, I used to work in Alaska with the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2001. And I met this man. His name is Ilarion Merkuliev. And he's an Aleut man, also called the Anungan people. And he has been working on giving talks around the world about how things have been changing in Alaska. So I spoke with him about climate change in 2017, just after I completed my dissertation work in the Sahel. And he told me about a recent meeting of indigenous people that had taken place in Kauai, in an island of Hawaii, during which the elders of that meeting were asked the two questions. One was, what is the state of the world as they see it now? And what must we be doing now based on that state? And their answers, Ilarion explained, were related to this vision I spoke about before, that we need to move from the head to the heart. And the other thing that they said was when they're talking with their children, when they're talking with them about what's to come, they're not telling them that they should go and stand on the front lines and try to protest anymore. They're telling them they need to start preparing for a time of destruction. And the other thing that happened during that meeting was that the elders were preparing. And so they were doing that by forming networks between different groups of indigenous people and talking about the medicines that they still had, meaning the herbs, meaning the prayers, and how to exchange those so that they could support each other. These are all lessons that I think we need to learn from. So Ilarion states in one of the talks that he gives, we've got to change our consciousness from the mind to the heart and let the heart tell the mind what to do. Elders say that each one of you has a gift to give the world right now, but to access it, you have to access your heart. To access the heart takes great courage. In the old world, the heart used to tell the mind what to do. Now we let the mind tell the heart what to do. So climate change. The consequences of climate change. Who wins when climate change disasters occur? Who loses? This is the question that I posed in my dissertation work. This is what I was trying to understand between those pastoralists and the sedentary people and the government and the various different policies that were going on in that country to help adapt those societies to climate change. This image comes from the Extinction Rebellion, and I thought it summed up pretty well what my findings were, in fact, that showing is that you have different levels of how climate change is impacting different groups of people. And the people who are the most marginalized, the people who are the most vulnerable, those are the ones who are experiencing those impacts first. And so the island nations, and then the poorest populations who are the most vulnerable, older people, women, et cetera. And then you'll have, various different scales. So this is something that we all need to be thinking about. And I read a lot through what Greta Thunberg recently shared at Davos with the World Economic Forum. And her words essentially are another call that reminds us, that really our house is on fire and that we need to take action. And the poignancy of her words is stressing that we all need to stand up to putting an end to fossil fuel extraction, exploration, and use as quickly as possible, and insists upon that. So I encourage you, I actually would love to read some of her quotes, but I can't read them from here. But I would encourage you to go online and listen to some of the speeches that she's given at Davos. Thank you so much, Scott. I would love to stay up there, but I need to read my notes too, and we don't have a cord that's long enough. Sorry. So I'm just going to read the last quote that, actually, I'd like to read this quote that really, I think what Greta was talking about was degrowth, in fact. She says, we're not telling you to rely on technologies that don't even exist today at a scale and that science says perhaps never will. We're not telling you to keep talking about reaching net zero emissions or carbon neutrality by cheating and fiddling around with numbers. We're not telling you to offset your emissions just by paying someone else to plant trees in places like Africa, while at the same time forests like the Amazon are being slaughtered at an infinitely higher rate. Planting trees is good, of course, but it's nowhere near enough of what's needed, and it can't replace real mitigation and rewilding of nature. So again, I recommend that you listen to her talk. But the reality is that she was doing something, this Fridays for the Future, because it needed to happen. And it's still going on right now. And we need to ask ourselves, I don't see many people who are 15 years old in the room right now. We need to ask ourselves, and what got us to this place? And how do we get out of this? And really what we're in right now is the age of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene has been shown to be a new geological epoch, right? humans have impacted their environment so profoundly with such lasting consequences that they've become a part of the geologic record. And while this is true that this is happening, there's different people holding different levels of responsibility for this action. One of the reports that I read recently that just came out from Binghamton University looked at the fossil records to understand the impact on the land over time. And it's known that Native Americans living here in New England for 14,000 years, having variable population densities over that time period, their ecological signals within that information that they were studying was essentially invisible as far as their impact on the landscape. After the arrival of Europeans in New England, however, large-scale cutting and burning of the forest, it was a very clear ecological record that was occurring there. Now, Naomi Klein, who has written, This Changes Everything, and there's also a film called This Changes Everything, has really pointed out how this shift towards the Anthropocene is stemming from the idea that we believe ourselves to be masters of this machine that we're calling the Earth. And so it's a lot about our relationship and our cosmology of how we're thinking about the Earth and the soil and really compartmentalizing those things out and then using them for our benefit. And in turn, we treat the economy the same way, as a machine, and we just need to perpetually pump more human and ecological capital into it and squeeze those things in order to have more growth. So I wanted to put this image up. This is showing insurance premiums over a 10-year period, and also the areas that have been hit the hardest in our country by weather events. Now, there's many different ways that climate change is pushing us to create boundaries and borders, not only around ourselves and our families and our homes because of fears that are related to this, but also on our borders, nationalism, for instance. And what this comes from and what this creates is it creates groups of people who have and have not, those who are on the inside of the wall and those who are on the outside. There's a couple books about this that I recommend you take a look at. One is called The Secure and the Dispossessed, and the other is Disaster Capitalism. And these ideas are exemplifications of how capitalists aim to profit off of these disasters. And they're pushing forward development agendas that essentially are pushing out the poor from spaces where they would rather be building things that are more gentrified, for instance. And the way that we're rebuilding areas that are destroyed from events of climate change is exactly that in many places around the world. So this creates changes to how we can afford land as well. And so when you look at insurance, it's really a great example that hits everybody pretty hard when you see the premiums rising because there's greater uncertainty about what will happen with the climate. So here we are. This is a scenario, and I'm not going to talk anymore about the gloomy and the dreary of that, but rather, how do we get here, and how do we get out of it? And I want to present two different, really, ideas that people have been talking about. One is donut economics, and the other is degrowth, and talk about the differences of those, and why degrowth is something that I'm aspiring to learn a lot about, and think how we can move into degrowth societies. So donut economics. So this is Kate Raworth's work. The idea behind this is essentially that she looks at this idea of growth as something unsustainable, because even though growth is something that can be good for our plants and flowers and watching our children grow and this sort of thing, and never-ending economic growth is not something that we want. We want growth of a society where we come to a certain point and mature, and then we thrive. And it's the same idea within nature, for example. And she uses this alliteration between nature's growth and how we need to think about our economic growth. And so there are limits that we need to put on our growth. And this is part of this donut that you're seeing. There's ecological limits, there's social limits. And if we have a shortfall, then there's certain people, for instance, that maybe don't have enough food to eat, and so you need to work on that area. Or if we're overshooting, then we've gone beyond what the oceans can take as far as ocean acidification. So all of these different things that need to be worked on are compartmentalized in the ideas that you see around the circle, which are climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, freshwater withdrawals, land conservation, biodiversity loss, air pollution, ozone layer depletion, et cetera. And the others are related to kind of our human security, or the things that relate to our well-being. She points out that Adam Smith even was worried about the ways in which the division of labor would impact people and humans, and the minds of humans. And so in thinking about the way that our garments are made in different parts of the world, and certain people who are paid 10 cents for that labor of making a single garment, and then they're paid $4, the foreman who's in charge of those people is paid $4 by the other person, and we pay $50 for the same garment. That way of creating profit through that process is depriving certain people of their humanity in many ways. And so it's, how do we move out of that is the question, and I'm not sure that Kate really comes to the answer in relation to those social issues as much as we need to come in this day and age where we have so much more vulnerability for the most vulnerable populations of the world, and where we're building walls to keep those people out. Another thing she talks about is the circular economy. So this is another idea that's been discussed in many different arenas. And the circular economy, for example, you can see here, this is a company that has been, Philips, that's been designing lighting as a service as opposed to as light bulbs. And so the idea that Philips has is that in order to create a circular economy, we're going to recapture the waste that comes from our light bulbs by giving it as a service, selling it as a service, just like Microsoft sells Microsoft Word now as a service, and we pay monthly for it. You know, the same thing will be with lighting, and the waste will be recaptured, and then they'll improve the efficiency of those light bulbs over time. So this is one way to recapture the energy that's being lost in the system through huge amounts of waste that we're putting out into it. However, there's still more raw materials that need to be coming into the circular economy. We can't always recycle every aspect of a product. And the other thing with this process is that it doesn't challenge the capitalist system at all. The owners of capital still maintain their capital, and people are just changing their products that they're buying and then throwing away to a service that they're paying for. So this is happening with transportation, with self-driving cars, for instance, as becoming the new taxis in cities and paying for access to transportation through a self-driving car as opposed to your personal car, for example. This is being tested in some cities around the world. I believe Barcelona is one of them where they're talking about it. Also, Mud Jeans has a system where if people return their jeans to them, they'll recycle those threads and then use them again. So there are some ways that people are talking about this. But there's some challenges that I see to this model of donut economics, and it's highly quantitative. And I know that sounds strange, that something would be bad because we have numbers that we can put to it and say it's good or bad, but I feel that degrowth is taking a different approach, and that it's saying we need more than just numbers. And I say that because with these ecological crises, that's something I worked a lot on within my dissertation. Tipping points is what it's called. And tipping points are, okay, so how much ocean acidification until we bleach the coral reefs? This is a tipping point. And when you get over the tipping point, you can figure out, okay, this is how far we can go with warming until. But actually determining those tipping points in real time with the data that we're able to get right now about this whole system is extremely difficult. And so a lot of science is failing to catch up to the needs based on the change as quickly as it's occurring. So my challenge then to this idea of donut economics is just that we're going to miss things unless we look at things from a qualitative perspective. And the qualitative is maybe going to indigenous people and asking them, what are you seeing? What are the impacts? How are you responding to it, for example? And including their ideas into science, as opposed to eliminating them from that. The other element that seems to be missing from donut economics that I think is essential is environmental justice and activism. We need people to be in the streets, to be talking about the change that needs to be occurring. That's an important part of what's happening in our society right now. So one forum where a lot of activism has been captured is the Environmental Justice Atlas. This is a project I worked for in Barcelona and contributed cases to, and every dot that you see on that map represents a different typology of environmental justice that's being calculated. And it's a group of people in some community that's standing up to various different forms of capitalist production in order to say, no, we want to maintain our ecological systems. We don't want to be exploited socially either. So I recommend checking out the EJ Atlas. It's an open source database online. So I pose this question, will Elon Musk save us? So there's a lot of really good ideas. There's a lot of people who have excellent ideas as to how we can change from an economy right now that is very destructive and bring us out of this problem of climate change through renewable energy, for example, through other ways. And this idea, technology will save us, really comes from this arena that we call eco-modernism. It's this belief that technological advances will get us there, but they really haven't, is the thing. And this idea that we should be optimistic because technology will get us out of the problem is keeping us in the problem in many ways. And the problem is to such a degree that it's not going to save us, unfortunately. So I'm going to move on from, and then the other aspect of that is thinking about something other than GDP, other than looking at the numerical values of worth and wealth and these sorts of things, is something we really have to move away from. And I think if we stay within the growth mindset, in this eco-modernism mindset, we're still looking at trying to maintain a growth-based economy, but growing differently, growing with renewables. And again, like Degrowth's response to that is that it's not possible. We need to have a different way of thinking and conceptualizing this. So why degrowth? As I was explaining before, the ways that we're developing, that we're growing economies around the world, we would need many more resources and another Earth, essentially, to sustain the way of life that we would like to achieve for everyone. We have to reduce consumption. We have to curb material wealth and reverse this trend also of the developed world where we're living to keep growing and growing. And we need to contract the global economy as a result. So less stuff, less travel, fewer jobs, fewer working hours. There was a research that was being done with Volkswagen where they were trying to see what would happen, what would people do if we kept employees on, but we gave them less working hours, so half the amount of working hours that they had. What would they do with that time? And the only requirement for the subjects in that research study was that they didn't work during that time in a different job. And the results are still coming out, but I think it's a really interesting idea to try to test and see, what else could we be doing? How could we be spending our time? Could we be spending more time with our children? Could we be doing artistic activities? Could we be pursuing some volunteer work in our communities if we were given more time and paid for that time as well? And the other thing about degrowth is that we need to permit underdeveloped nations to grow and improve their quality of life. It isn't a mantra that says, no, everyone must, go to a certain level and those who haven't developed need to stay there. Rather, we're saying, no, it's more about the developed world changing. So there's 6 drivers that I wanted to share that lead towards degrowth, that are driving this, and that really set the stage as to why this is a more viable solution than, say, donut economics or only thinking in eco-modernist ways of using technology to solve the problem. So that's, firstly, is environmental degradation. It's the fact that our throughput of materials through this economy is creating lots of waste, and it's causing damage to the environment. The second is that resource depletion and the challenge it poses to economic growth is too much. So here you have children who are in the Dominican Republic of Congo, which is one of the top producers of cobalt. And cobalt is an ingredient that is used in electric car batteries. And again, this scenario of child labor, exploitative practices environmentally won't end just because we switch to renewables. And so the question that we need to ask is this kind of haves and have-nots world one that we still want to see? And unsustainable pathways of capitalism. So this constant reliance on exploitation of someone to build the capital of others is something we need to move away from. A constant through flow of energy and outflow of waste while reducing costs. And the owners of capital remaining the owners of capital instead of spreading that capital in different ways. Another reason that degrowth is something that's coming forward is because people are interested in seeking out new concepts of civilization that are based not only on increasing their investments or the return on their investments and buying bigger homes and selling and renting their properties at higher values, but they're looking on different ways to share the table, to expand their table, to welcome people in that aren't based on enclosures or putting up walls or excluding people. And another big challenge we're facing is an institutional crisis, a democracy crisis. Electoral absenteeism is one example. Rise of nationalism and of the extreme right, etc. Rise of racism in our culture. These types of challenges are very social, and they're related to this capitalist productivity as well. One thing that Gareth Dale says, he's one of the scholars that's looking also at degrowth, is we either need to have eco-socialism or barbarism. And this concept, I think, comes from some of the things that I was seeing with certain groups of people being marginalized politically and then further marginalized when there's a crisis, like a flood or a drought or a hurricane or fire. Those people can't stand up on their own. And so what will they do? Where will they go? It's this idea of, how do we support people as opposed to allowing them just to move into this idea of barbarism? The other thing that we're facing in our society right now is this crisis of meaning, a desire to disconnect from this mass consumptive society and also from technology and get to know each other again and have more conviviality with each other and more social events with each other and look at each other and know our neighbors and these sorts of things. So really this means, a society that's based on frugality and on being more social, inviting people over, etc. So these are the arguments for degrowth. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is now, and what it is not. So what degrowth is not, is it's not just a greening of the existing modes of capitalism right now. It's really looking and addressing and countering this fetishism with growth and saying, no, a rising tide will not lift all boats, in fact. No, it's the sea level rise that's lifting the boats, but not the rising tide. Also, it's not the prognosis that for negative GDP growth. We're not saying we need to have negative GDP growth and degrowth. That's not the point. That's not the idea. It's also not green growth through more taxes and then policy stimuli and other policy reforms. I know that some of that's what the Green New Deal is doing, but I would propose that we need to broaden our views of what the Green New Deal should be here in Vermont, for example. So what degrowth is it's a removal of growth as an economic necessity, this focus on GDP, the focus of policymakers that GDP is the way forward, that they have to look at growing their communities and their cities as the first priority before all other priorities. This is what needs to go. It's a critique of colonial relations and this dependence and exploitation. So certain societies that are dependent on other societies that are exploiting them for various different wealth that they have either in their soil or in their bodies or whatever it might be. So eliminating the colonial mindset. It's also a reevaluation of alternative cosmologies, like Indigenous peoples' views of how we need to change ourselves and learning from those and challenging this Western view of progress that's quite limited. And also degrowth is inspired by many of these environmental justice movements that I was talking about before, a lot of which come from the Global South. So this is an image that I thought would be interesting just to help you understand and see the difference between kind of the growth-based economy, which is the element with this trunk in the air, kind of a same of the same, which is the elephant with this trunk right forward, and then this idea that GDP needs to go down, which is less of the same, the elephant with the trunk down. And none of those things are degrowth. Degrowth is simply different. And degrowth has taken on this idea of a snail, because we all need to be thinking more like the snail, slowing down a bit. So it's this idea that energy, materials, and waste flows in our throughput through our economy, if they increase, well, then the well-being and our health of our society and our environment will decrease. And this is something that has been shown through all the practices that we've had so far through capitalist production. And rather what we're looking for is difference, justice and equality, more sustainability, democratic and responsible self-management, conviviality, non-commerciality. I'm going to move through that. So the Green New Deal. Is degrowth relevant to the Green New Deal? I would challenge that we need to formulate a Green New Deal that includes degrowth. And I want to talk a little bit about what that would look like and challenge you guys to think about that. So AOC in this video that she put together, I don't know if anyone's seen it, it's a really excellent film that is illustrated beautifully, and it talks all about how we need to have a new vision for a new future. And I think that's a really beautiful way that we need to be thinking about our future, is coming up with visions and dreams about what we would like to see for our communities, and then demanding that those be put into action. One example, so France, along with a lot of the EU, is working to phase out short-term single-use plastics, and you can see they're going through this process over a period of years to phase them out. And I have a friend who lives in Barcelona who, when she heard about that policy change, said, oh, that's interesting. You know, I've got such a desire to do something to support that. So she came up with this company. It's called Bitsy Bags, and they hire people in Barcelona to work for them, and they source their materials locally, and they make these bags that will be resistant and long-term for use, that will replace the plastic bags that people collect their vegetables in the markets in Barcelona. And she started selling them in all of the organic markets, and it's doing quite well. And what I would say about this, and just challenge you to think, is her idea, is this degrowth? Does this fit within what you understand about degrowth? No? Some of you are shaking your heads no. Maybe uncertainty, some uncertainty? Yeah? Yeah, I think, here's the thing I want to say about that. There's not one right answer. Degrowth is a process that we're trying to figure out. So there's two things about this. It is kind of saying, okay, well, there's this new, let's replace some old material that we're using with a new material, right? And let's produce something new. Let's come up with some new product that also has a waste flow from that product, right? And there's also people that are using it. I mean, you could go and get an old cloth bag and use it for your vegetables as well. But the idea also here that is a part of degrowth is the longevity of this product versus the plastic bags that were used before. And that is an aspect that's relevant to degrowth. We want to look for economies where things are going to last for a long time. The other side of degrowth is thinking about back to the landers. I recently went to hear Peter Gold, who's here tonight, read his book, which talks a lot about this movement here in Brattleboro and throughout this area of people who came here and start growing their own food and start really relying on themselves. And while I was there, I met John Shaw, who's also sitting in the audience tonight, and I was very impressed because John, when he introduced himself as the care provider for his family. And he explained to me the economics of providing care for his children and how that worked for him. And what he explained was that if there were two people in the households who were both receiving incomes, well, yes, they might be making more money, but what about the intrinsic value that's lost from that because you're sending your child to another care facility to receive care from another person and paying that person to deal with childcare? And he pointed out that really a part of what he sees as degrowth, and he is a degrowther, is this need to recognize and value the things that don't have monetary value. And it goes back to this idea that we're so stuck with numbers, needing to know how much, what's the bottom line of things, when there's intrinsic value in a lot of things that we possess and that we can give that don't actually need to be monetized, like childcare, for instance. But somehow this idea that we need to have a bottom line, we need to have a net worth, and that's part of our identity, has really fooled us. And it's gotten into our politics, it's gotten into the court's decision about who deserves what in a divorce, for example. It comes into measuring even, whether or not I should be speaking you tonight because I have so many degrees attached to my name, and that's my number, right? Well, like I said before, my best education didn't come from those degrees or those institutions of higher learning. It came from the pastoralists that I met in Niger, who had never been to school. And the idea that they had was very similar to John's idea about caring for their children. So much that when the French came into Niger and wanted to take the children away from the families and give them an education, a French education, and teach them to read and write, a lot of those parents hid their children just like the native people here did. They kept them in their homes. The reason was because they found their education was much more interesting for their own children than what they could get from modern school. I think the microphone is back. Okay, good. So this is one idea. The other idea of degrowth that's come forward is the idea of basic income, which we've heard a lot about within the elections. Other ideas that are practiced here in Brattleboro is the idea of a digital commons, where we can go and we can offer certain things, whether it's a skill that we have that we want to share with others, or whether it's objects that we want to get rid of, that we want to give to others. Or even, someone recently got her hair and nails done for her wedding through the credits that she had gained through time trade, for instance. And the other thing that's an element of degrowth that's essential is civil disobedience, that we need to be taking part in civil disobedience and standing up when we see things that need to be done in our communities and responding to them and taking part in direct democracy. So these are just a few examples, some of the youth in Brattleboro that staged a die-in during the strolling of the Heifers Parade in June, and Abigail Munkin, who sat with other activists to block coal trains from entering into New Hampshire. So degrowth is many different things. I'm not going to talk about all those things tonight because I'm really out of time, but I wanted to challenge you all to think about what you've seen here in your communities that might represent degrowth. Because as I said before, this is a discussion. This is an unfolding of an idea. Economics is not a science in that way, in that it's malleable. And this concept of degrowth is challenging us to, again, challenge the system that has created these problems and find ways out of it. And there's a lot of different ways. So I'm going to close with a couple stories. So I wanted to tell you about my friend Mokhtar Bouba. And he shared a story with me about his theory of the environmentalism of the goat. So Mokhtar grew up in southern Morocco, and he shared with me that there are a lot of things that he saw that came to his village during the time that he was growing up there. And some of those were plastics. A lot of shampoo bottles, and then things are wrapped in plastic, and there wasn't a system for really disposing of those, so they were thrown away. And what he noticed was that really, they had more of a degrowth society when the goat was able to eat all of the things that they were throwing away. So the cloth that they were using and all the other things that they're producing and the vegetables, the goat was able to consume all those things, but not the plastics. So that was how he realized, this change. So we're going back again to grass and to milk and to rain here, but yeah, really, I think the environmentalism of the goat is one way to think about degrowth. So this picture is again from Alaska, and these are thick-billed murres. And when I was working there as a biologist, I would walk out onto these cliffs and just sit and watch the murres, and I would wait for them to stand up and show me if they had an egg or not for my own research. And it was just this amazing cacophony of, caw, 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 and it was really deafening. I couldn't possibly think about anything because they were so loud. And what this enabled me to do actually was to return to my heart and really love that place and feel something about that place. And Larry used to talk about how the birds also had that effect on him. The other thing that happened to me when I was going out to these cliffs every day is there are Arctic foxes that would wander about the cliffs also. They were also opportunistic, looking for ways to catch a bird or a chick. And they were so playful. So as I was walking, I had these big rubber extra tough boots that I would wear. And there was one Arctic fox that, got so comfortable with me, he came right up behind me as I was walking and nipped out a piece of my boot. And so I still have this hole in my boot from the fox. So yeah, but I really learned to, love that space and those places. And I think it's important for us to have a love affair with the space where we live. Ilarion speaks in his message that he shares with the world about the Hopi and the Maori way of moving back into the heart, and that it's first needed to let go of the sides of the riverbank, kind of this metaphor representing our possessions and our attachments to materiality, and move to the center of the river. And that's where we find our center and our heart and our consciousness as well, which consciousness could be God or however you want to think about consciousness. And then the next step is really to find others who are doing the same, who are releasing those attachments and then returning to the heart. And really supporting each other to diving wholeheartedly into that. So I want to leave you with this image which comes from the wisdom weavers of the world. And I want to read a little bit from what was shared with by the Council of Hopi Elders that gets back to this idea of the river and our metaphor. They said, "You've been telling the people that this is the 11th hour, and now you must go back and tell the people that this is the hour. And there are things to be considered. Where are you living? What are you doing? What are your relationships? Are you in right relation? Where is your water? Know your garden. It is time to speak your truth. Create your community. Be good to each other. And do not look outside of yourself for the leader." Then he clasped his hands together and smiled and said, "This could be a good time. There's a river flowing now very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid, and they will try to hold on to the shore. They will feel that they are torn apart and will suffer greatly. Know the river has its destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, keep our eyes open and our heads above the water. And I say, see who is in there with you and celebrate. At this time in history where we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. From the moment that we do, our spiritual growth and journey comes to a halt. The time for the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves, banish the word struggle from your attitude and your vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. Thank you very much.
For those of you who have read Rumi, the Persian poet, if he was here, he would be in tears and he would be a very happy person because he just heard his theory presented by our distinguished speaker. He also believed, listen to your heart, let your spirit run your heart, and let your heart run your spirit, and the world will be more beautiful. That's what we heard tonight. So as a humble request, please make your question as brief as possible. We have over 100 people tonight, which is great. Make your question brief so we can have answers to as many of you as possible. Any question?
And if you could just wait for the mic so everybody can hear your question. Thank you.
So the challenge is, what are the 6 steps, 10 steps to shift from a growth economy to a non-growth economy? Mm-hmm. And how long might that take? And how does one manage, this is 3 questions, the pain of making that change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I would challenge you that it's not necessarily painful. I think that, again, as you saw with that elephant trunk, we're not talking about decreasing GDP, right? We're not talking about stopping, going to negative growth. It's more about, we need to think differently about how we're making our choices. So a lot of it is an individual practice, but it's coming from a care for others. So I don't have the steps, right? I'm not here to prescribe how to do that exactly. I think the challenge that we need to be thinking about is recognizing what's going on. and recognizing that this idea that we are at the top of the food chain and that others will serve us, well, that's not serving us anymore, because we've killed off a lot of the planet, right? We've damaged the systems of the planet. And so we need to get out of that. We need to get out of that, and we need to recognize, how do we be good neighbors? I like this idea of conviviality. And there was a really great video that I saw of a woman who noticed that all the people in her hallway in her apartment were just getting on the elevator, going up and going into their rooms and closing their doors. And so she and her roommate brought out a table. It was an ad for, I'm not sure what the ad was for, but they brought the table out in the hallway. And then when people came up in the elevator, they said, oh, there's something happening here. And everyone came together. All the people came out of their rooms. They started talking to each other. They started listening to each other. Started learning from each other. This is conviviality. This is the idea that we are the solution, that we have the solution, but we need to come to each other and talk to each other about how to do that. So, sorry to disappoint you, I don't have 6 steps.
Any other questions? One here.
Coming.
How, if this is the case, does degrowth grapple with the issue of population? When I was born, the population of this earth was 3 billion people. The population of the earth 60 years later is 7.5 billion people. The population of the earth in 30 years will increase by the amount of the number of people that were on this earth when I was born.
Right.
So you talk about conviviality and working together.
Yeah.
What happens when you put more rats in a smaller space? How do we work together, and how does degrowth deal with the fact that we simply have too many people on this earth?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's a really great book that I've been reading that was written by Yorgos Kallis, and he's one of the scholars who's been writing a lot about degrowth. I think he has 3 books that he's published on degrowth. And it's called Limits to Growth, Why Malthus Was Wrong. And so Thomas Malthus, as you know, he developed a theory in 1798, during the time when people were leaving the common spaces with their cattle, moving to the cities. There was this labor market that was building in cities in the UK. And so the population growth idea there at that point in time was that Malthus, even though he's really proclaimed to be kind of saying that population growth will cause resource depletion, and a lot of people use this neo-Malthusian thought about the environment that if our population keeps growing, we're going to use more resources and it won't be sustainable. Really, if you look at what Malthus was writing and what he meant in his writings, he was very much a proponent for growth. And what I mean by that is that his essay was, that you'll see if you do look at this book by Yorgos Kallis, his essay was understanding that because these labor markets were moving people out of the rural areas to the cities, that was actually creating more benefit to people and to markets and to the growth that they wanted to see of these industries. And so there was an encouragement to, he wasn't trying to discourage population growth, essentially. But a lot of our ideas have been based on that essay that, in fact, we can't grow in this unsustainable way. But there's been a lot of scholarship that's shown, from India, for example, that there are ways to organize ourselves and to come up with solutions despite what we've seen as this population bomb idea, right? So I guess what I'm doing is challenging the belief that too many people is the problem, right? And rather that we need to think differently about how we're treating those people in those scenarios. So instead of saying, okay, as Malthus was proclaiming, he really wanted to point out that you can't have equality, it's impossible. And so his essay was putting forward those ideas, and that's essentially the same ideology that growth and capitalism is based off of. So degrowth comes forward and says, there's another way of doing things. We don't have to have this have and have-nots. We can have a more socialist, eco-socialist approach that will allow for more social justice for people. And then, perhaps, if you're still fearful about what will happen if people keep reproducing, well, we are able to make choices about those things. And those choices come when we do have more education for people. This socialist approach really does bring opportunities to be informed, to understand what's happening, and to make choices individually. So, yeah, I mean, I think that it seems doom and gloomy when we talk in the way of Malthus, that, you know, too many people, too little resources, we're all going to end. But I think we need to recognize that there's another way to innovate through social innovations and coming up with ways to work together.
Thank you, Julie. You began by talking about moving from head to heart, moving from quantitative to qualitative. I'm wondering, do you see a role for faith communities in promoting degrowth? And if so, how? And perhaps, I might, encourage you to talk about your experience in sub-Saharan Africa and how the idea of the transcendent or theology impacted on their understanding of the environment. I realize as a Christian that Christianity has been one of the major, if not the largest, culprit in this sort of modern philosophy of growth. Everything from the Industrial Revolution to the Protestant work ethic, et cetera, et cetera. Yet when I read the Hebrew scriptures, they reek of the environment. When I read the Christian scriptures, they are pregnant with the environment. When I listen to the Quran, when I listen to the prayers, it's full of the environment. Is there any role for faith communities, or have they completely lost their own sort of scriptural origins?
Thank you. That's a really great question, a really great discussion. I'm not a historian, so I would refer to Claire Guinness, who's sitting in the audience here, about history. But I would say that religion itself, you're right, there's a lot about these various different ways of thinking and being that come through religion that support an environmental ethic, that enhance our environmental ethic, as well as our neighborliness and our way of, being an economy of care for one another. And that's something that I found also in the Muslim societies where I lived. I told this story the other day on the radio. I remember when I was staying in a nomadic camp, and I had been given a small bucket to go and bathe, and I walked far away from where the tents were into this pastoral area and found a small tree, the only small tree that I could find, and to squat behind and do my washing. And there was a viper also enjoying that tree. And he let me know he was there, and I froze and then backed away and, got back to camp shortly after. And I was frantic. And I said, I saw this viper, and, he was just there. And the practice there, when, you have someone who's upset about something, is to do something about it because it's your guest, right? And so you wanted to care for that guest. But my host said to me, this was a Tuareg man, he said, Julie, we share the space with these animals. And so normally, because you're upset, we would go and we would kill the viper if you'd like. But because we share the same home as them, would you be comfortable allowing it to live? And I was so touched by their perspective on that. And these are Sufi Muslims, and so they practice, a moderate form of Islam, even though that's changing with the infiltration of a lot of new ideas in the Sahel. So yeah, I would say that a lot of the religious beliefs and practices do support this ecological ethic. But this colonial mindset, and this is why I say I'm not a historian, so Claire might have something else to say, but like the colonial exploitative mindset is really the thing that's been married together with Christianity and with Islam even. And you see that with radical Islam in the way that it's taking over the Sahel and Sahara. It's a political power, it's a political force, and they're trying to gain territory through that. So yeah, I would say it's more about that.
Barry, hold on one second. Here I come.
The graphic that you had with the match, and it had animals first and rich people last. So presumably there's been some scientific or scholarly research as to what it is about having wealth that will allow you to survive climate change. Knowing what that is, what ways are there to convince the rich people that it is in their best interest not to hoard the wealth?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a choice we all have to make, right? And I mean, you looked at that map for insurance prices and looked at it coupled with the map of the United States where there's the most crises that have been occurring. And there's a lot of insurance companies that are saying, here are the places where you should move to. Here's the type of house that you should build. And the people who have the means to do that sort of thing are the ones who can manage to do it. And the other people who can't change their houses, that can't, refurbish things so that they're, their fields so they're drought resistant or flood resistant or whatever it might be, they need help from the state. And so I don't know if we need to convince rich people to do something. We do need to have more action in responding to in creating more democratic processes and forcing more support for people who are in need. And migration in our country is already happening because of climate change. There's people who are moving out of the areas that have been impacted by floods and by hurricanes. So I think already we're in need to be thinking about how are we going to address this need? How are we going to deal with rent prices that are skyrocketing? So I don't know if we need to go and try to change rich people's hearts. I mean, we can try, but I think the important thing is what we can do politically.
I had a question. Can I steal my own mic? Okay, yeah. My question was about the youth. You worked with youth, and I have a daughter who has worked with you and loved working with you on that direct action. But sometimes I notice that I sense in the youth today despair. And that could be caused by misunderstandings about the future, but it could be caused by maybe good understandings. When the climate scientists say we might be ready to be past the tipping points, and you are now cursed to live in a boiling, dry, volatile weather planet. The cities will all crumble, the oceans will rise, and you will have to be like Mad Max, making your way through the future. That's not an exaggeration, I believe,
Right.
of the vision and the hope, the dreams that the 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds of this planet are living with every day. And I have great empathy and compassion for this youth generation, because I didn't feel that way when I was 13.
Right.
I had great hope. The stars were the limit, and now they are looking at the future and thinking, I better learn how to start a fire with 2 sticks and how to find water by digging holes in the ground. That's maybe the skill set that they'll need in their future. So when you're faced with students of that generation who come to you with those visions and dreams, what do you tell them? Does degrowth give them an alternative reality that they could see themselves inhabiting in 50 years? I
I think the answer is we need to listen to what some of these elders are saying, which is what is the medicine that we have to give? And what is medicine to the Hopi elders, for example? And that medicine is ideas, it's strength, it's prayer. It comes in many different forms, and each parent knows what they need to give to their child, I think. For me, I don't have children, and I have nieces and nephews, and I'm not sure that they're experiencing the same despair that your daughter is. But when I was working with the young people on that activism and the speaking, that panel that we put together, I listened to them. I provided a way for them to talk about those things and opened up the forum, and I hope that did some good. So I think we need to recognize, yes, we didn't grow up with this problem. It wasn't a part of, when I was a kid, crawling through the backyard and playing with worms and digging in the soil, I had a very different idea about what the world would be. I think it's important to encourage them to talk about those things and to take part in civil disobedience when you can. The other thing I wanted to talk about is just there's this idea that we need to limit ourselves. And we're really against limiting ourselves. We always want to say, well, the sky is the limit, and we want to provide everything our children can possibly have and give them the rights to access the whole world. I think that ideology is something that we need to rethink. It's not that we need to look at our children and say, well, you're not going to be able to do all the things that I did. No, it's more asking ourselves, was that helpful to us? And I say that knowing that I'm someone who's spent a good part of 15 years of my life traveling the entire world, using up what more people use in a lifetime of my carbon footprint. And I don't deserve to travel at all anymore, really, because I've used it up. I've used up what I should. But I'm not sure that the learning that I could have gained from staying put and doing what the Back to the Landers did here in Brattleboro. I'm not sure I would have learned more from going and talking to those pastoralists than I would if I had gotten to know people here. I'm really not sure. So I say that from the full knowledge of the privilege that I've had in doing those things, but I really feel that in my heart that we don't have to, we don't have to go far in order to learn the lessons that are important for us as humans.
Oh, wait. We got one in the back who raised their hand first.
First of all, thank you for your talk. It was so enlightening. You had said when you were talking that degrowth doesn't necessarily apply to developing countries, that actually a growth model is in order for them. How does this degrowth perspective envision that growth in a way that won't repeat the mistakes, possibly, some of the criticisms that you put on the screen about the growth model?
Yeah. And I definitely addressed that growth model in Niger as something that was not so positive to certain groups of people who are being marginalized through a specific model of what growth should look like, those pastoralists. I think the one thing that can happen is opening up information and so that all the countries of the world that are in processes of development can access technology and information in order to choose how they want to go about that. But it's true that the process still demands people to stand up for their rights and for justice and social justice. And as we were talking before, just about these workers who are receiving 10 cents for the jeans that they're making that are going to the world market and we're paying $50 for. Those workers also they have to be able to have that process of working towards having access to the livelihood that's more viable for them. So I guess what I mean by degrowth isn't necessarily designed for those cultures specifically is not totally accurate, because there's a lot of elements of degrowth, this conviviality and maintaining these incredible cultural concepts and cosmologies like Ubuntu, as a part of the learning that people are going through. Because this cookie cutter, everyone has the same education, everyone does the same medical practices and ways of developing and houses and types of water usage, just isn't it's not logical for all places in the world, especially some of the dry lands where I've lived. They shouldn't have the same houses we have here. It wouldn't make sense. So it's coming up with like the better models for growth, but not limiting the throughput process in the economy for parts of the world that still have, some way to go to get to a standard of well-being that we have more easily here.
My question is, every fall when I'm raking about 60 to 80 barrels of leaves, what to do with them rather than go to the recycle center? And I've often thought, why couldn't they be shipped abroad to be put in like the Sahara Desert, and that area could maybe be reclaimed with their own plants and trees, and if you start with an acre, maybe the following year to be another 2 or 3 acres, and something about reclaiming, it would help the universe, help us on the earth.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of studies of soil now that say if you leave your leaves on the grass that they'll actually help regenerate soil. And that's actually a big movement throughout the world. It's called the 4 per 1,000 initiative. And it's just scientists have figured out that if we put carbon back in the soil, it's not through some technical process. It's just through allowing decomposition to occur and to allow the soil to regenerate. So there's a lot of farmers and people here probably who have some specialty in those things. I'm not someone who has land and is farming here, but I would say, maybe it's useful to the people in other places for you to sequester the carbon through your leaves and your soil.
We have one more, the last question, and then you guys can go home. Make it brief.
I have 2 points. The population issue in most African countries from 1960 to now, the population has gone up 5 times. Mm-hmm. But the birth rate is beginning to go down now. And the reason it's going down is because of growth. There's a contradiction here we need to face. Mm-hmm. My other concern is that for hundreds of years, even in the United States, we've had groups of people interested in what could be called degrowth. And I think there's a lot we can learn from them and why they have never expanded very much. And that is the intentional communities. Mm-hmm. I've been involved with them over the years, and there's a lot of ways that they are trying to live in a degrowth situation. So please learn from them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think you're right. As far as your point about the growth in African countries, Niger is one of the countries that has the highest population growth rate in the world. I think it's 4%, even now, even today. So yeah, they're faced with a lot of this issue of how do we, in a Muslim household, if you have 2 wives and each wife has maybe 5 children each, what does that man do to give an inheritance to his sons when that inheritance, or sometimes also to his daughters, when it's usually the land that people have invested in, or maybe their animals? So yeah, there's definitely big challenges of the burgeoning families and burgeoning populations in those parts of the world, and I observed a lot of that. I would say that while growth is the mindset and the understanding that we have to describe how those economies are changing so that population growth is going down, I would challenge that and say, I bet there's a lot to do with well-being. And what I mean is access to education, access to healthcare, those sorts of things. So development, growth, they're tied together, but maybe we can decouple them. Maybe that's possible also, to say, no, we need to work on well-being as well. And that's the focus, not just economic growth. And what would be different then?
Okay, guys.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you for coming.